You made it! Yay!
You're fine.
Matt,
Yes.
I don't know if you saw my email. Let me go back there. I don't know if you saw my email that Commissioner Ushold is not going to be able to attend last minute.
I just saw it. And
Okay,
I see
great.
Dan was able to make it.
She's here, yeah.
I hurried. Didn't speak, but I
Not too
hurried.
fast.
Nope.
Public meeting.
Lisa, has there been any discussion of when we go live back in chamber, or is that still kind of up in the air?
Yeah, no discussions that I know of. So I know staff is still working remotely if able, so no updates yet.
Okay.
We'll keep you posted.
Natalie, Tia, are we good to start?
Yes, we're good to go.
All right, Mr. Chairman, you're good.
All right, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I will now call to order the Thursday, March 25th, 2021 meeting of the City of Sugarland Planning and Zoning Commission. Good evening. It's good to see you, fellow commissioners and city staff. I hope everyone is doing well. Start with item 3A, public comment. Citizens who desire to address the Planning and Zoning Commission with regard to matters on the agenda will be read and or received at this time. Do we have anyone signed up for public comment?
No, sir, we do not.
All right, I'll close the public comment period. We'll move on to item 4A, consideration and action on the minutes of the February 9, 2021 meeting. Everyone should have received the minutes in your packet. Any corrections, or do we have a motion?
Move to approve.
Second. Got a motion to approve by Dan and a second by AP. Any other discussion? All right, please vote at this time. And I think that's unanimous of all present, unless I missed anyone.
Suzanne?
Yep, Suzanne. Thank you. All right, the motion passes. Item 5A, workshop. Tonight we'll be looking at the review and discussion on the implementation of the regional activity and neighborhood activity centers as defined in the 2018 land use plan. Ruth, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know we've got several guests in attendance this evening as well, and I will let you introduce them as we go along.
Great. Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. We are really pleased to be here with you this evening. I am joined by Cam Urity, the city's public-private partnerships manager, as well as our consultants with Clarion Associates. And I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves. But Cam, if you want to just say hi for a moment and just introduce yourself to the commission real quick, and then I'll jump in.
Great. Yes, thank you, Ruth, for chances to say hi to this board. I don't believe I've had a chance to talk with you before, but I am the P3 manager, public-private partnerships manager in the city's Office of Economic Development. So glad to be working with Ruth on this project and excited about the chance to hear some input from you all tonight as we do this workshop. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Okay, so for this evening, if I could get that PowerPoint back up when you have a second. I'm going to start with just kind of a background and reminder of the land use plan, and then also a reminder of the development code, and then some specifics on this particular project and what our aim is with this project. And then our consultants, Matt and Gabby, will walk you through some questions and discussion to get your input on the project. Oh, next slide. Next slide. So as you may know, the land use plan is one of the city's official master plans. It's one of the 8, and it is Chapter 6 of the comprehensive plan. It outlines the policy direction and guidance for land use decisions and reaching the long-term vision for the city. It includes some really important features like the future land use map and categories, goals and policies, and areas of change map, as well as some action items that help us actually implement the plan going forward. Next slide. In the land use plan, it identified some new land use categories, the latest update, which was adopted in 2018. It identified some mixed use areas, the regional activity centers and neighborhood activity centers throughout the city. These are envisioned to be mixed use centers with office, retail, amenities, as well as residential and public spaces. So there's 5 regional centers and 9 neighborhood centers. And these are, they show up in multiple places in the land use plan. You can find them, there's kind of general category descriptions as well as some more specifics about them in several goals in the plan. And then the plan also identifies a vision for each of these areas. And so really, if you can go to the next slide, please. The regional activity centers are envisioned to be the commercial and civic hubs for the city and for the region. So these are drawing people from across the Houston area. And again, they would be vertically mixed use and have public spaces, walkable pedestrian streets. Think kind of Sugarland Town Square is a good example of a regional activity center, kind of the beginnings of a regional activity center. And these could include both low all the way up to kind of high-rise buildings. Next slide. The neighborhood activity centers are more smaller scale mixed-use centers that are sort of a main street for the nearby neighborhoods. And again, these would be vertically mixed use, but also could be horizontally mixed use, have the public spaces and pedestrian friendly and other amenities that you would see in the regional activity centers. As I mentioned, they'd be a little bit smaller scale, so these would be more like low to mid-rise buildings since they are largely adjacent to residential areas. Next slide. So our current process for implementing mixed-use areas is through the Planned Development Zoning District. And this process encourages innovative concepts that are not permitted in our standard zoning districts, and it's intended to permit flexibility in development proposals. It currently outlines elements of both urban and suburban PDs. And what this does is help provide some certainty for development of a PD process. It also defines really what high quality development is in each of those kinds of PDs. And the different standards are distinguishing between urban and suburban. Also, the Planning and Zoning Commission can approve a PD with that differs slightly from what's established in the code if it achieves high quality development. And then the Commission and Council might also find that additional standards are appropriate in addition to what's in the code. Next slide. So that's just kind of a general background of the land use plan and development code. And so now I'm going to just talk a little bit more specifically about this project. And so we're talking about this now because it was one of the action items in the land use plan to identify the best way to implement the regional and neighborhood activity centers. These areas are largely built out. And so the way that they're going to become mixed use centers is through redevelopment. And so we want to proactively pursue the vision for these regional and neighborhood activity centers and not just kind of sit back and wait for them to happen on their own. We also recognize that as part of where we are in our life cycle as a city, as recognized in the land use plan, we're kind of at that crossroads where we're going to start seeing some potential for redevelopment coming up in the coming years. And so we want to be prepared for that and be ready for when the market, when it makes sense for the market to see some of those changes. Also, as I'm sure you all know, COVID-19 has, really changed things for a lot of these retail centers or retailers in general. Commercial centers have really evolved in 2020 and will continue to do so. I think in some ways, the pandemic has really accelerated some of the trends we were already starting to see beforehand. And so, really looking at this now gives us an opportunity to stay competitive in the region and just to continue to push ourselves in that evolution as a city. And then finally, we want to just do what we can to support our local businesses and commercial properties. And so this process will hopefully help us to align our processes to their needs going forward. Next slide. So the land use plan encourages us as a city to be more proactive in redevelopment and directs us to evaluate the best way to implement regional and neighborhood activity centers and medium density mixed use. And so it says that we should consider either potentially creating new standard mixed use zoning districts or whether we should continue using the PD going into the future for the redevelopment of these areas. And so in order to do this, We're working with a consultant, Clarion Associates, who we have here with us this evening, and they're helping us with doing some research and evaluation of what our kind of future process should look like. Next slide. So Clarion Associates is a national consulting practice with over 25 years of experience. They focus on plan implementation and user-friendly codes, and are leaders in innovative codes integrating traditional and form-based approaches. As you can see, they've worked with communities across the country, but includes several cities right here in Texas. And so we felt that they were a really good fit for us because they have a good understanding of Texas law and Texas culture, but they also have some exposure to projects and communities across the country that will bring just some different expertise to the table. Next slide. So what Clarion is working with us to do is identifying 5 to 7 cities in the Texas or United States who have implemented redevelopment of mixed-use areas through zoning. So what we're really looking for is kind of those, great examples of other cities that have what we're looking for. And so what they're going to do is then analyze and document the other cities' approaches to implementation of mixed-use areas, as well as talk to their staff to really understand what's worked well and what hasn't in their approach. Because sometimes you can't get that just looking at, what's on the code. And so talking to city staff will really, I think, provide hopefully some enlightening information. Then they're also looking at our current process, the PD zoning process, and identifying the benefits and disadvantages of it. And then finally looking at what other tools cities might use besides zoning to incentivize redevelopment into mixed-use areas. So are there other regulatory things that we can do, or economic development incentives that could help offset development costs that might be used to incentivize redevelopment? Next slide. So we've identified the cities and kind of case studies that we want them to look at together. And so they're going to be looking at Fort Worth, Louisville, Plano, Cary, North Carolina, the Columbia Pike redevelopment in Arlington County, Virginia, and then Henderson, Nevada. So it's a really good sampling of kind of local Texas communities, and then a few abroad in other states. Next slide. So what we're going to be looking for you to do in the future is, once we finish that process of working with talking to the other communities and getting their input, is we'll be sharing some options with you as a commission and getting your input on that future process, that future zoning process, and then looking for you to make a recommendation on what you think that process should be based on our findings. Next slide. So tonight we are here to just hear from you, and this is a really important discussion for us going forward, and we're really excited to hear from you. We want to make sure that we take the time that we need tonight. So as you can see, this is the only item on the agenda. So we have plenty of time to walk through the questions and just hear your discussion and your thoughts on this subject. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt Goebel and Gabby Hart, and give them a chance to introduce themselves. And just thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you tonight. And I'm here to answer any questions as they come up. Thanks so much.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Ruth, for the introduction. Again, I'm Matt Goebel with Clarion Associates. I'm a director with the firm. We are based in Denver, but like Ruth said, we've actually done a lot of work in Texas. I'm from the Dallas area, and I went to school in Austin, so we do a lot of work in Texas still. So we're always excited to work in the Lone Star State. And I'll be the project manager, but I'll let my colleague Gabby introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Matt. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Gabby Hart, and I am an associate with Clarion, helping Matt on this project. And I'll just echo the appreciation for you all being here and you all taking the time to talk with us. You all know your zoning processes really well, so we look forward to hearing from you so that it can improve our recommendations for Sugarland. Thanks.
Thanks, Gabby. So this next part of the presentation is we're going to tee up several meaty issues that we'd like to get y'all's feedback on. So as we get back into the PowerPoint, we thought we would frame this next part of the slides with, first of all, just telling you about what we've heard from some of the other folks that we've started to talk with. Now, as Ruth said, the project's just getting going, but we have had a chance to talk with a half dozen or a few more stakeholders, people in Sugarland that own property, that have done development projects in these activity center areas that are identified in the plan, some of the staff members that are involved in administering the zoning ordinance. And so we've started to get a little bit of the lay of the land, what some of the issues are with how activity center redevelopment has been done in the past, how it might change in the future. We just wanted to highlight some very preliminary key themes that we've heard. First of all, in terms of the plan development process, y'all have got some good results. We saw a nice virtual tour of the city with Ruth and with Cam, and we've seen some of the great work that's been done in the plan development areas. But the applications themselves have become, pretty challenging. They're pretty labor intensive over time. They've become more involved as the city's expectations have gotten more sophisticated and more detailed about the type of development quality you want to see. There has been a level of unpredictability there as well, just for different projects. Because each PD is a separate negotiation, there's a little bit of unpredictability about what might change from one project to another in terms of the city's expectations. So we heard those themes come up a couple of times. Process has gotten more difficult over time with a higher level of detail expected earlier in the process. And this is not unusual in our experience, in other communities that use PDs a lot. Y'all need to know what you're going to get with a PD. You need to see that level of quality. And so, more is expected in applications, but that does translate into higher upfront costs for an applicant, for example, more time with the staff. And also, it's not on this slide, but the process for amending a PD has come up several times as, sometimes that can be cumbersome as well. We heard a few things about the current base zoning districts as well. Primarily when we would ask people, why are you going to a PD? It's because the base zoning districts in the Sugarland zoning code don't really allow for the flexibility that you're looking for to achieve the type of mixed-use redevelopment that is really clearly called for in the plan. And then finally, we talked at a general level with all these stakeholders about their images of high-quality mixed-use redevelopment. Based on their experience in Sugarland, but also in Texas and around the country, what are the key aspects of high-quality mixed-use redevelopment? And one theme really started to emerge there, which is that collaboration between the private sector and the public sector has always been a really key part of the special sauce in attracting and achieving that high-quality redevelopment that people want to see. So those collaborations are something we've tried to ask more questions about, and we'll do more of those question asking when we get into our research with the other communities that Ruth mentioned. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the next few slides, I thought I would just walk through them quickly to give you a sense of all the different questions that are on our plate. And then we would step back and walk through them one by one to get y'all's feedback and discussion. But I wanted to walk through them quickly just to give you, just the overview. First of all, it's that last issue that I mentioned on the prior slide. What is a successful mixed-use redevelopment? What is it in your mind that is really important to you? What are the key features of a successful activity center? Is it the way the buildings are arranged? Is it the way that the site features, like here in Town Square? Is it the way that the landscaping might be integrated into the overall site design? Is it the pedestrian amenities in terms of plazas or maybe public art? Is it the building design itself? All of the above. What are some of those issues that you think are really important to focus on in successful mixed use? And then also, what have you seen elsewhere that you think we should look at as potential really exemplary redevelopment projects that come to mind that would be a good example for us to learn from? Could be Texas, could be somewhere else. Next slide, please. So the first question was generally about what do you want to see? What do you think potentially are the barriers to achieving those goals currently in Sugarland? What are the zoning code barriers that have been, developed over time that may be keeping people from doing the type of development you want to see? And we just have examples here just to illustrate the broad range of activity centers in the different case study communities that we'll be looking at. Next slide. In the zoning code itself, the current Sugarland zoning code, are you aware of any specific barriers that may discourage or prevent mixed-use redevelopment that we should be looking at? Sometimes it's not a matter of writing new regulations, it's a matter of getting the code out of the way. And so maybe it's an especially restrictive use table, say, that is keeping a real mixed-use environment from thriving. That could be an example of a zoning barrier. So another question, what new provisions, including regulatory incentives, might be considered in the code to promote or incentivize mixed-use redevelopment? I've got a graphic here from Henderson, Nevada, on the right, and that's an example of a community that has adopted dedicated zoning districts specifically to get at mixed use. And so they've got a set of districts. This is their neighborhood mixed use, but they've got a couple of other flavors as well. But the point with mixed use districts is to say that's where mixed use is encouraged by right. We're not going to make people jump through a lot of hoops. We're going to create a district that's specifically designed for that type of activity center environment that you've called for in your plan. So that's a potential tool that could be used to help promote and encourage that type of redevelopment. The bottom bullet, what standards or forms could you see being consistent across multiple activity centers that could be incorporated into a mixed-use zoning district? I'll give you an example there. Oftentimes when people think about activity centers, they think about the pedestrian environment. These are places that are supposed to be really pedestrian friendly, have really nice sidewalk areas that are connected to the buildings, and it's a little bit more oriented towards people and pedestrians as opposed to always just being oriented towards cars. And so there might be a consistent set of sidewalk design principles that apply across a variety of activity center areas. So that's an example of what we're thinking about there. Next slide. Now let's ask generally about the plan development process that you have now in Sugarland, because as Ruth said, that is your primary tool, to develop and redevelop in the activity centers. What do y'all think are the strengths and weaknesses of the current process? Have they produced the outcomes that you were expecting? If you were involved in the original approvals years ago, have they actually played out on the ground the way you thought they would? If not, could there have been changes or things that maybe should have been revised or improved to get a different outcome? And then this last question is pretty technical about the PD process, but it's important to note that Sugarland has actually developed a two-step process for PD development. First of all, there's this general development plan, which is a high-level concept document, and that's followed by a more detailed final development plan. And if you've gotten down into the weeds of the zoning ordinance and into those procedures, do you have any comments about how well that process works? Could that potentially be simplified? Because again, as Ruth said, one of our tasks for you is not just to look at those other cities and what they're doing, but also to make recommendations about the current procedures you have in place. So with that's my last slide with questions. And what I would propose is that we go back, if we could, to the slide that says mixed use redevelopment. And we walk through each of these slides, these 4 slides, one by one, and just have a conversation and get y'all's feedback and any ideas or thoughts or answers that you might want to give Gabby and me and Ruth and Kim. And we may want to just start before we get into the substantive questions. Does anyone have any just general questions about the scope of work that Ruth talked about, or just the scope of the project?
Yeah, I did. This is Commissioner Parikh. I had a question on the timeline for the benchmarking or the reviewing of the other communities. What does that look like, and when is the soonest we'd be able to consume some of those findings?
Great question. We're trying to keep the train running pretty quickly and efficiently. So the first half of the year, we'd like to be done with all this. Ideally, you'll be seeing us late spring to come back with the results of our research and to get y'all's feedback on the final documents.
I guess what do you think? You briefly touched on the COVID experience in the development process, and we had a request for changing of a zone recently, and we pushed it through pretty quick. But do you think that your survey is going to be outdated already because we're moving into uncharted territory and development with the way the workforce is going to come out of this somehow, and is that something that you're going to try to include in your recommendations, or is there just not enough data there to understand what's going to happen? And is it possible you might recommend delaying large changes until we find out what more is going to change after we come out? Sure. in terms of development, or what the developers are looking to do? I mean, the market's going to drive that.
Yeah.
And the market's not there yet, I don't think, right? So
that's a really interesting question, Commissioner, and it's very timely, obviously. I think COVID is just going to have ripple effects, for more years than we can imagine at this point, both in terms of planning process and development process, and also ultimately in terms of land use development patterns and the places where people are going to be living and working. So I think it's important to be aware of that and be aware of that new dynamic in the mix. I don't think that's, at this point, I don't think that's a reason to delay the analysis necessarily, or to start looking around for good examples. But I do think that's a good thing we should be talking about with these other case studies, and to start to get a sense of their observations about changing retail mix, or different types of requests from developers, or maybe again it's about planning process and what are they seeing in terms of people being involved in planning and development review. I can tell you from our perspective as a firm and the other projects that we work on, projects have kept going during COVID, and so we've moved for the past year to a mostly virtual online world. And that's had some pros and cons. We haven't had as many public meetings, but in many communities, we're actually getting higher levels of public engagement in our projects because people are coming out that might not have been interested in showing up to an in-person meeting in the past. We're seeing the overall level of engagement be higher. So I just throw that out as an example of that wasn't what I was expecting at the beginning of this, and I think some of the impacts of COVID are just still unexpected. So this is long-winded, but I think it's something that we should ask the communities about when we do the research, and we'll just work carefully with Ruth and with Cam as we think through our recommendations to see if there's any timing implications for the project that might come out of that research.
And if I could piggyback on that too, just to kind of clarify that at this stage in the process, we're really in what we're calling phase one of the project, which is really just evaluating the process that we should be using going forward. So we're not at this point going to come to the end with recommendations for what a mixed use, exactly like what the percentage should be, or exactly what a district might look like. It's more about, should we have a standard district, or should we continue using the PD process, or is there some other mechanism that we can use that will better serve us in the future? And I think to the extent that it can be flexible and responsive to things like COVID, will be better served in the long run. But I think by the time we get to the point of kind of the phase two implementation part of it, we will be a little further along. I agree that we're going to be seeing ripple effects for a long time. And so obviously we won't be through it or see all of the impacts in the long run, but we'll continue to have a better sense of what some of the initial, at least, impacts will be. So we'll have a little bit more time to kind of assess that as we get into the implementation part of it.
Yeah, along with Commissioner Hart's question, my question was, you looked at 6 other sites, 3 in Texas and 3 across the country. Are you looking at the maturity of these developments? And I'm guessing you are, because clearly some of the more recent ones can probably better reflect some of the trends that may plug into our community a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. One of our criteria for selecting the communities was just how long they had mixed-use redevelopment projects in place, because we wanted to see a time record there to see just how things have played out over time. But also, we'll be looking especially at the newer stuff in those communities to see how they're doing projects now that they've learned the lessons of doing this over a decade or so.
So I have a couple of questions. I thought it was, first of all, I love all of this. I think it's innovative and I think it's coming. Whether we accept it or not would be a bad thing if we didn't, because it's the next step. With COVID, we've seen that working at home is the way that we're going to be starting to live. I mean, people are already buying homes with offices. So the question is, when we talk about these racks and necks, do we see, what type of housing are we looking at? Are we looking at live work? Are we looking at multifamily? And I know you said higher end. A lot of people here don't want the high rise in the neighborhoods areas. So what kind of housing does that leave us?
That's one of our questions to ask and to research in all these communities, is very specifically, what are the housing types that they've had and that they've found most successful? I can tell you from the experience we've had already in other communities, there's not a one size fits all. It's typically an array of housing options in different places. It's oftentimes, it could be accessory dwelling units. We see those. We see high-end condos, above the office on the first floor. We might see side-by-side townhomes that are nearby some of the non-residential, but not immediately adjacent to. When we did the tour, the virtual tour with Ruth and Cam, we saw some of the great townhomes that you've already got there, I think in the Floor area near that project. And that, when I saw that, I thought, oh, well, I've seen some of that in successful activity centers in other places around the country. So that could be an option as well. I will tell you, we're looking very carefully at your plan. Y'all are very thoughtful about housing options and what should be in a successful activity center in your plan. And so that definitely will guide our research as well.
Kind of a follow-up to that, if you don't mind. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Susan.
Thank you. Kind of a follow-up to that is you mentioned, or you had on one of your slides, Collin Creek in Plano, which was a mall. And I've been asked this question a few times about what's going to happen with our mall in the future if we shop differently, because things are changing. So do you think something like that is capable to come in here and make that change as a rack or a knack, and we can use something existing without having to do too much reconstruction? Because what little I saw in that picture looked really interesting.
Yeah, and that was just an example of that community. I wasn't intended to say this is what's appropriate for Sugarland or not, but I don't know. I talked to economists and people that deal in the retail market, and they just say everything's in flux. But people are more interested generally these days in open air environments, things that are not enclosed. They're looking at redevelopment scenarios that bring more light and air into those experiences. But there's a lot of opportunities to do new things, interesting things with those old malls. Denver has a suburb, Inglewood, that had a very thriving mall for a long time, finally closed down. They demolished part of the mall. They turned part of the existing structures into a new city center campus. They turned part of it into a big center for outdoor art sculpture. So it was a variety of things that they brought in a mall redevelopment. There's just interesting examples like that around the country. So,
and if I may, Matt, really quickly to address that is, we clearly have to, as one of the top sales tax producing areas of the city, the Economic Development Office and the rest of the city maintain a pretty good working relationship with our partners over at First Valley Mall. And I think learning what other communities have done successfully in their activity centers through this process will only benefit that relationship as we continue to see what they may be thinking, and have conversations about how to move forward together.
And also, just to jump in there, that mall property is part of the Town Center Regional Activity Center. So it is an area that, fits right into this conversation. Obviously Town Square is already kind of meets a lot of the characteristics that we're looking for in the long run in terms of pedestrian friendliness and kind of how all the uses interact with each other. But the plan envisions that will go beyond Town Square and include the properties all the way to, I think it goes to Lexington and then all the way over to Sweetwater. So that's definitely part of the conversation here.
If I could jump in, I've got about 7 or 8 things that I hope I can remember. First of all, could we go back to that slide, please, with the questions? One thing I can remember that's not on the slide is the complexity of the PD process, and are we familiar, this group? I would argue that the 2 who were most familiar recently left the commission. Kathy was there for Town Center. I think Carl was as well. They were both there for Imperial. And I don't know any other PDs that came through during that time. Successful mixed-use redevelopment project, what are key features? I'm an engineer, I'm not a planner, but my exposure to this community on this commission, particularly on this topic, is radioactive. That when Tract 5 developer came in and said, I don't remember what the original number was, 1,200 apartments, I think, people came out with torches and pitchforks. Chambers filled up. There was such a hue and a cry. We're residential, we're single family, we want it that way, it's going to stay that way. We want nothing to do with this, go away, thank you very much. No, 900 won't do, no, 400 won't do, no. I'm sorry, it's a half sarcastic characterization, but it was a difficult time. And for me, it made me realize how averse this community is to multifamily. And we did the traffic impact analyses, and staff came up with crime statistics, and we came up with those that were already in the city before, multifamily was effectively outlawed. And then as a result, one of the results, and I forget what document it's in, maybe you can help me here, Lisa, but it was a guidance, and the guidance provided for certain percentages or a formula, and there was an ultimate maximum number of multifamily that could be constructed in the city total for from this point forward, and it was a number that Carl was able to refute as a requirement that was a guidance, wasn't a zoning regulation, but Carl was, as a developer of 40 or 50 years, he was able to say, there's nobody who's going to put in 17 units on a parcel and make money, or whatever his example was. So I would argue, and I can remember Kathy saying that one of her biggest regrets was not allowing more taller townhomes, taller condos, whatever we have here in Town Center, to provide more owners and more pedestrians. What we have in Town Center is good, but it's Friday through Sunday good. It's not great Monday through Thursday. And the report and the outlines and stuff here, very well done, and on its face, reasonable and laudable. But when you say it needs to be a mix of commercial and business and so forth, we're struggling to keep storefronts open in Town Center. We're struggling to keep storefronts open throughout the city. I mean, everywhere I go, even in Sugarland, Missouri City, for lease. I mean, and it was before COVID. I understand COVID's going to have an accelerating effect on that, and I think that's what Ruth was referring to earlier. I don't want to monopolize this, but I think if our goal here is to write better language and put incentives in there and provide for developers a nice pathway, an easier pathway, very good. I'm on board. Let's do it because we need it. And we have been charged to do so. Nevertheless, it isn't like you build it and then we'll come.
Okay. Well, let me jump in on.
Oh, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to jump in on that. I mean, Dan, I appreciate a lot of the comments, and I think everyone here, whether they were on the commission at the time or not, remembers, what an arduous process it was to have the land use plan, and the people that were on the advisory committee will back me up times 10 because it was more arduous for them to put it together. And clearly we went through a lot of machinations when we discussed that and approved it. But, I guess from my standpoint, one is we have the final work product. We've got the land use plan. It's been enacted. We made our recommendations. Council acted on that. And so we have what we have. And what I'm understanding the process tonight to be is one in which we are not putting the cart before the horse, but instead we're trying to take a look at some of these questions, if we can work our way through them, and get input from this group and feedback regarding, what kinds of things are success. So, when you make the point that, look, the mixed use developments have got to be economically viable. Well, yes, it does. And I think that this process is designed to kind of get our input and our reactions into the city, so that they can think about the types of things that are going to make it. So what I would just say is, we have the plan, we have the framework, and I think we should let the Q&A kind of unfold to direct the discussion a little bit more, so that we can give these folks some of the focused feedback that I think they're desiring to hear from us tonight.
I appreciate that, and I agree with it. I came out very negative, but it's the pragmatist in me. I'm sure they've been told these stories. They have a little inset on their documents here that described it. And again, I'm in. I'll participate. For instance, the second question, I would answer City Center up there at Beltway 8 and I-10. But from what little I know of that place, they have a lot of apartments in there. So here we are, Tract 5, we're trying to develop it, and it fell out because of apartments. So let's have the conversation, because I'm afraid we're just going to bump into that again and again and again. So
and
no matter what the language is.
Yeah, and if I may, I appreciate all of the comments. We're not necessarily here to kind of rehash the land use plan. As the chair said, we do have an approved document. We're really trying to focus here on the process and how to actually implement the recommendations of the plan. And so I think as we get into the questions, more so on the PD process and what other options there might be, is where we're trying to really focus, getting some feedback on, because that is really the charge of the consultants, is to look at the process and how do we, whether it's updating the development code or creating a whole new process, zoning process that developers would go through. What is the best path forward to
I understand.
Get to development, which may not happen, which probably won't happen overnight, but in light of some of the changes or some of the things that we've been experiencing, we may see redevelopment happening sooner rather than later.
Well, I hope so. Please don't anyone misinterpret. It's once bitten, twice shy situation, because the reaction was just so overwhelming. And yes, we did forge a solution, and here we are. So, yeah, I would say City Center seems to have something going, because they're doing all right. At the same time, I watched the State of the City today, right? And there was a section in there about how we exceeded budget expectations with everything that everybody did at the city, the community, the businesses, and so forth. It was a success. We rose to the occasion, and we succeeded, and everybody was to be commended. So we're up for the challenge, and I'll back off. I've said it.
So there was a nice PD, Lisa. Do you remember the one over by Imperial, the redevelopment of the sugar mill? That I thought would have been a very successful one. That was a very nice reuse of historic structures, and it was tying in, the history of Sugarland a little bit with a new twist. I thought that was. I really surprised that one fell out. That was a good one in Sugarland. I thought. Just as one example, I don't know that they've ever seen it. That Clarion has seen that one, but I thought that one was pretty nice.
We have talked a little bit about the history of that Imperial site and the project with the staff.
Yeah.
Well, the other one that kind of comes to mind is the old TI building in Stafford, right? Where I forget what it's called, that development, where there's, I think it's supposed to be multifamily hotels, and there's already restaurants that are going up there, and that's right down the freeway. And so, sorry?
The grid is what it's called.
You got it. That was the other one that came to mind as well.
Right. So put in and out, and we're done. No,
get a whiskey cake and in and out, and yeah,
you're done. Right. No, and I think the comment about the Commissioner Hart's comment, I think that's a no-brainer too. And when you look at looking out in other cities, if you look at I can't remember if it's called the Pearl District in San Antonio, right, where they've taken the old breweries and they've taken that area and they've added everything that we're talking about adding to a center like that, and they're kind of preserving and building on the history of something and some of the structures that are there and repurposing and adding to that. I don't know the economics of that and whether or not that's been a successful redevelopment from an economic perspective. I suspect that it has been. There's no reason that we can't do something like that here. But I would cite that as another example, although outside the city, of something that I think is worked really well.
Well, Oklahoma City has a beautiful one, right? What is that called? Bricktown?
Bricktown, yeah.
Yeah, and then I believe you showed Louisville. They had one. I don't think we have that large of a area that has that many historic structures, but those were, in my mind, great successes of repurposing, old historic buildings into new uses, and it kind of ties back a sense of community to keep that here, old Sugarland to new Sugarland. So those.
Historic preservation sometimes can be a good match with these goals because it's what's unique to the community. And if you can preserve some of those unique, distinctive places, that oftentimes we've seen has been a good anchor for mixed-use redevelopment around the country. So like the Imperial building is a good example of that type of building. We've seen in other places, like in Colorado, they've turned some of those old grain mills into spaces for artists' lofts and artist studios, things like that.
And as you look at that in the repurposing of the historic areas or the older areas, I think the big question here that goes to answer your first question that's on this slide is, what does Sugarland want to be when it grows up? And I wasn't part of the pushback on the multifamily, but to Dan's point a little bit, that's got to be part of the discussion moving forward as we look at what are the key features and having that multifamily and finding a way to get that across. Because if we're not careful as the communities around us are going to build these, and we're going to find ourselves with empty retail and empty developmental spaces because the grid developed, and we're not that far away, and people stay in their backyards, and either you're an attraction or you're not. So, site design is absolutely critical. That what you have there, who lives there, who gets there. If it's, if the town square is a great example of a beautiful place, but it's a destination. And if it's purely destination, it's going to be difficult getting full-time traffic in there to support the businesses you want to support. So, we're beating a dead horse here, but I want to support it from a developer side and tell you guys that that's got to be part of the discussion going forward, is how do we do that and to what level while we still support the single family community idea. And I think at some point in time we have to discuss with and convince the community that to do this and continue to be economically viable and vibrant, it's got to be part of the discussion.
I totally agree with Commissioner Brown. I mean, we've got to have a place for people to live so they can stay in the community to put their sales money back into the restaurants we're building around them. Absolutely. And they've got to be the high-end type we were talking about before. They can't be the type of living places that can't attract and keep people here. Absolutely. I want my college kids to come back home.
Well, I don't know how you work this in, but I think an important part, and I was on the commission during that time also, an important part of that whole discussion was the school issue. And that's outside the purview of the Planning and Zoning Commission. But, you know, how you work a mixed-use redevelopment is going to be successful if there's a school system there that can support 500 units. You know, I think outreach to the school district and early coordination with their planning will make these mixed-use developments more successful, and you can approach the communities, you know, and alleviate that problem if you work in tandem with Fort Bend ISD. There was, you know, I'm sure Dan remembers, there was tremendous pushback, mostly about Clements. And you know, there's two things you don't mess with. And that was one of them. And so, you know, I think if you want to add what's successful, my idea is that the community buys into it also, so we don't run into the problems that Dan was talking about. And the PD process that we go through now, it gives opportunities to the community to have comment and input. It's a little cumbersome, but there's checks and balances that the community and the commission and others can come in and have input on, and that's, you know, it's successful in terms of the community getting what's best for the community, and hopefully the developer, you know, working with the community.
Excellent. I may be getting ahead of myself here, but in this literature, there was reference to a demand for like 2 kitchen households, or a demand for multifamily households, or second on-site dwelling, and demand for amenities that are within walking distance or bicycling distance. And is that something that the city hears? Does that call come in to planning and zoning? I mean, who's, for a bunch of people in single-family residences, who is making these requests? What's the source of that characterization, those characterizations?
I know some of that comes through, I remember seeing it when I was in development planning. People would submit plans for a new home or to redo an existing home, and they would include features that weren't allowed, like, you know, an accessory dwelling unit that was too large, or a secondary kitchen for, you know, the parents or the in-laws, so to speak, you know, to live in the home, or some of those other things. And we would get calls periodically from people who were interested in those kinds of things. So I see Lauren has popped up. I don't know if she wants to add to that, but I think that's where at least I have seen some of that come through.
That makes sense.
Nope, you're absolutely right, Ruth. I was just going to say that's the kind of starting point for that is if it's not a call, it's a residential building permit, or we're taking a look at something from a permitting standpoint. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's move to the next slide if we can. I'd like to get some of these other issues on the table. It's a good conversation, and we're starting to get at all these issues. So just a reminder, this question was about, you know, is the code in particular getting in the way? Is the zoning code acting as a barrier to achieving some of those mixed-use projects that we've been talking about? Y'all have already started to answer some of this to an extent, but is the code a barrier? Are there other barriers that you see? General thoughts?
I would defer on this one because I don't think we got in the tall grass like staff does. I can't imagine how many exchanges there are between any developer and staff, how many weeks, months, how many iterations before we ever see it. So I can't answer the question.
Agree with you, Dan. Yeah.
That's true. I mean, I would comment, and I agree with you. I think, we kind of need to take our cue from staff here. Looking at some of the comments that you presented in the slide based on the stakeholder discussions, that the process is, it's time consuming. Yeah. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing. And the process has become more difficult and we require more specificity earlier on. Again, I'm not sure that's a bad thing either. I mean, I don't want to, if a developer is saying, well, gosh, it's just taking a lot of time and energy and effort and you guys are really putting me through my paces. Again, I don't think that's a bad thing because we have to balance the desire for development along with everything that requires protection in accordance with that. And so to me those seems like strengths, and I don't have any issues with if we said, well, we need to create a zoning classification for the kind of PDs or the kind of mixed use developments we want to have in Sugarland. I don't think that's I don't think that per se is problematic. But I think you would have to address why that needs to be done as opposed to, being able to do it through a PD. I mean, you may find that the PD process gives you more flexibility than you would have if you had a mixed use zoning. But I mean, I think I'm open to that. But at the same time, when we talk about streamlining and all that, that's great from an efficiency standpoint. But I don't think anyone on this group is really is going to sign on to something that just that makes it easier to do this, but leapfrogs all of the time and effort that goes into the detail and making sure these things are right. And a lot of things, just thinking of other things that we've considered, a lot of times when we're catching stuff and we're getting down on a detail level, it's important. And all this stuff needs to be done right. So I would just make that observation.
Commissioner, that's a really good segue actually to the next slide. If we could just put that up there. I want to just talk a little bit more about that Henderson example, just for y'all's context. Henderson is an example of a place that established these dedicated mixed-use districts as opposed to always going through the plan development process. But that's not to say they took away opportunities for community discussion or community buy-in. And it's not to say that they've got just a cookie cutter that is the same all the time. Basically, that code establishes guardrails for, or baselines for what the standards generally should be in a mixed-use environment. So, if it's going to be mixed-use, you're going to have this nice sidewalk environment that's required, and you've got to have the buildings brought to the sidewalk. That's just an example of a standard that they might have. So there's a baseline there. And then through the development process, they still can talk about deviations from that. But it's a benefit in that they're not starting from scratch each time. And so a developer who comes in has a little bit of sense of where we're going to end up, and that it's going to be consistent with other mixed-use projects generally. Not that it's going to be cookie cutter exactly the same, but it's always going to be moving in the same direction. So they're just not having to start from scratch every time. Just want to throw that out there. And we'll be talking with them. They've had that in place now for 10 plus years, and so we'll get some more on the ground intelligence about how that's worked and what they might change. But I just wanted to clarify, it's not an attempt to get away from, project-specific discussions and negotiation at all. It's just trying to move the baseline forward.
So, may I ask a question?
Sure.
So, when you're talking about simplifying the process, you're not talking about making it easier. You're talking about making it more comprehensive to be for a specific type of zoning rather than a general type of zoning. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, simplification is in the eye of the beholder. But I generally, when we talk to developers, they say we really would like to have more clarity up front about just what you want to see. And even if it's a higher level of quality that's going to cost us more, we'd rather know up front than having to spend time in a kind of black box of negotiation where we're not sure what's expected of us. And so,
if I could comment to that your guardrail illustration is a good one, because as someone that's looking for property, you initiate the talks with the landlord. Are there deed restrictions? That's one layer. And then are there PD restrictions? That's another layer. And then are there city requirements? That's another layer. And if someone's going in to develop an area, it can be very cumbersome trying to get through everything. And then you still sometimes find out there's a prohibition or an issue there. When you have something like this that's right in front of you, that you can look at and go, I can live with these 16 things. This is an attractive piece of property, or an attractive area for me to be, or something attractive for me to build. It at least begins that conversation much more rapidly than a developmental company or an individual having to go in and go through all these steps himself. It opens that process, and to your point, it brings everyone through a chute, and I think it's a great point.
Can something like this be tied to the size of the area that in consideration? Meaning, if it's a very, very small area, then obviously the PD process can be extremely cumbersome for the reward that their developers getting. But if they're going to redevelop, just 100 acres as opposed to 5, that's mitigated by the size of the project. But I can tell you, and I think Matt brought it up, we caught something on every PD that was submitted. A lot of times Carl would catch it with the garbage cans being backed up to view of everybody coming into the development. And he goes, I'm staring at garbage can doors. This garbage truck's going to go right by. And so there's so many little intangible things that would be difficult to try to put into, I think, a large area of redevelopment that, maybe if you could tie it to a smaller area that wouldn't have so many moving pieces. We always caught stuff about material types on the outside of buildings, or it was just, there was always some kind of consistency that was always picked up in the PD reviews. And it wasn't always just Carl. Everybody that's been on here has caught something, I'm sure. But again, I don't know if you could tie it to the size of the development. Has anybody done something like that?
You definitely could, Commissioner. Yeah, you might have minimum size thresholds for when these districts could be used, or when they'd be appropriate, or maximum size. There's definitely examples of that around the country. Your example of the screening that's actually a really good one. It could be that looking at some of those old PDs and looking at the things that y'all have had to catch over the years might lead you to some standards that you just think should be citywide standards moving forward. Maybe you need to beef up your standards for screening of trash collection areas, or screening, that's a very common standard, actually. That would just be citywide. And that's a good example of establishing a higher baseline in the code. If you've just got good standards for building design, or good standards for sidewalk design, and you say, hey, everybody's got to comply with those, that's the baseline. And then the PD comes in and you talk about where they're calling for exceptions from the baseline. That's another way of simplifying the process, because that baseline becomes clearer to everyone.
I have a question really to staff, but it speaks to this slide. I can remember a time when companies wanted to move to Sugarland. We had to turn them away. And my first question is, I wonder, is it still like that? The second point to these incentives on the questions here, and maybe Ken can speak to this, or staff, but I know we've done tax abatements effectively. That's brought some pretty big players in here. And then lastly, public-private partnerships. Are those incentives like already in play, and that's nothing new?
Yeah, great questions, and I'll start.
Cam, do you want to take part of that? And I'll take part.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I didn't see turn the mic on.
No, that's okay. Mine will probably be real quick, and then I'll let Cam get into kind of the eco dev. I don't want to step on his toes there with that, but
step away.
But Commissioner, to your question, I mean, we are certainly, turning folks away is sort of an interesting way to put it. But I will say that we are, even through COVID, there are still a lot of folks that want to come to town and they want a place to be. And they, really, some of the stuff we're facing is due to our vacant land. We just don't have big areas where that may already not be spoken for. Apologize for the screaming children. That we can't have anybody, because we just don't have the land. So
Right. That's good to hear.
Yeah. So there are definitely folks that want to be here. No matter what process they have to really go through, it's really a matter of finding it. Now, I think that will come into play more with the redevelopment, which is what part of this project is going to be. Is how can we redevelop a lot, especially the business park. A lot of those older 70s, 80s buildings and things. That will be coming into play, I think, as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to echo what Lauren said, when we talk about industrial and manufacturing type larger primary employers, the primary issue that we're having is that we just don't have enough vacant space to accommodate the people that inquire and want to come to Sugarland. When you ask about incentives, we do have a pretty standard and robust incentive program or economic development incentive program. We utilize tax abatements, we utilize direct incentives and other P3 mechanisms, and we've got a lot of experience doing that with, again, those primary employers. We tend to be large office corporate type companies, and then industrial manufacturing, those types of companies. What we're starting to hear more of is the types of businesses that may one day populate these redeveloped centers, right? So more lifestyle type businesses, food and beverage are asking now about things, incentives and sharing agreements and things like that. That we're having conversations, but those were things that we haven't typically done, and so we're having to rethink what our role is, what's appropriate, what's worth it for the public good, and also what makes sense for us to step out on the ledge for.
So you would gather this information, you would approach the owners, right? And by means of what we're developing now, say, there's a path for you to redevelop your land and get high-end clients or owners or renters like this, right? That's where we are.
Absolutely, and so we had both started that effort just prior to COVID. It was really serendipitous timing that COVID then hit as we were starting to have those conversations, and then getting into our external stakeholder interview processes. I've actually yielded some very positive conversations with some property owners around the city. So the process is really helping out there.
Good, thank you.
Should we go to the next slide? Yeah, we all started to talk about this. Sounds like your two commission experts on the PD process are no longer there, but we all got some familiarity with the particular process. And this was just an opportunity to have that conversation and to talk about if you've been happy with the results and if you have any thoughts about the process that you've heard of from your staff.
Yeah, I'll set this up, even though it may just be straw man is not the right word, but just to start the discussion, I'll defend the current process. I think that the strengths of the current process are that it's in phases. I think that gives us an opportunity to make sure that the developments meet all of the standards and the criteria we have. You've heard discussion on this meeting tonight, we've caught mistakes in the process. So I think, having to do a preliminary and having a chance for feedback and then having come back and having someone, be in the position of having to present their best final product and then even getting a chance to tweak that before it's voted on. I mean, I think it's a good process. One thing, and this is not much as a comment as much a question, but I'm hearing in your presentation and the discussion unpredictability, and I get it that people want certainty, but can anyone point to a concrete example where, for instance, this body anywhere in time has done one thing on one PD and then they've done something radically different on another PD that would send the message to the developer that in fact it is a black box and you can't figure it out, and good luck and let it fight? Because I'd like to more detail about whether that really happens or not. I get the importance of it. I'm just not sure the current process is creating that unpredictability. Maybe it is, but that's what I'd love.
Good question.
Well, I think, and I didn't mean to leave out Jay, because Jay was on for a long time also, so he can probably address this. But, with the turnover in the commission, everybody had their own kind of pet issues. We had an arborist or someone that was really good with with what types of trees, what types of plants were going in this. She knew, and I can't remember her name, Lisa. I feel bad about that, but she was right on. She knew every plant. She said, "No, we're not having this plant ever." And if without her, I would have never known that this plant was so awful. But so that in that respect, there is a little bit of that black box. But I think on the high ticket items, it seemed to be consistent, and I know staff is probably going to be reluctant to knock on past P&Zs maybe, but I'm sure there was a little inconsistency again with just the turnover. We all recognize things based upon our experiences, and we all remember the code to our own abilities and our own how long we've been on. So I guess there is that. Not that I'm against the current process. I'm just saying that, yes, I have seen sometimes, even amongst the two experts, I've seen them review something different in two PDs.
I'd like to know what Chair Gallagher had said, that we need a two-step process. There's so many clarifications, not just errors, but correct. There are some errors, but there's some clarifications and suggestions in the first round that you've got to have the second round to before approval process. So before we can go to send that to the city council. So we've got to have this two-step process to catch a lot of the items. And I think we've been fairly consistent over the years that I've been, the 7 years that I've been on the commission here, that but every PD is different. But
Jay, I agree with you. I think the process is fine, and oftentimes we've said it. And Matt, I agree with you as well. The process works, and like we're the last line of defense in something that's going to be here for 50 or 60 years, so if it's going to be in this city, it's our charge to, kind of make it right. So I don't have any issues, but again, the tall grass, if there's something internal that staff thinks, well, we could tweak this and tweak that, and I remember seeing in your introduction, Matt, that you guys read this stuff, you get into it. So if you find something in there that can be finessed, I'd be all for that. But I think overall, it's a good process.
If I could jump in, I did just want to step back a little bit. The intent of this slide is not to criticize the plan development process. It's not. We're really trying to be neutral here. We're just trying to get y'all's feedback. Is it? How do you think it's working? When I first read it, when I read it for the first time, there's some things that are really good in there. The fact that you've got that two-step process is something a lot of communities don't have, and that's a really good thing, because you've got that opportunity to have a high-level conversation first before it gets too detailed, and then gets more detailed later with that final development plan. So it's didn't want to be critical at all. I did want to add a couple observations, though, just from our work in other places. You know, over time, as you do more and more planned developments, those all become individual zoning ordinances that basically take on their own care and feeding and have to be administered by staff. And so that just presents a real challenge in terms of resources and administration. So that is a practical thing that a lot of communities that we work in face, you know, as they start to see more and more planned developments. You've got the zoning code, and then sometimes you've got, 20 or 100 plus, PDs on the side. So that is a practical issue they deal with. When we see communities that do a lot of stuff through planned development, it typically is because the underlying code is just leaving out some issues, or it's not getting you the type of development that you want to see. And so that is why communities like Henderson often look at supplementing the planned development with some additional base districts. They don't get rid of planned developments altogether. They've still got that tool in their code. They still do PDs. It's just not the go-to solution every time. And it lets you all not have to be so focused on the details every time. If you can go ahead and create standards up front with you all that are good standards, that are going to ensure high quality development, then you've got them in the code, and you don't have to go through and be the fact checkers and look for those mistakes every time. So that's just some of the theory why communities look to try to supplement the planned development. But again, they don't get rid of it altogether, and that's certainly not the intent of this slide. We're just trying to get y'all's thoughts on how it's being used. Other comments, other anything that we've talked about, the zoning code generally, mixed use areas, planned development, any other thoughts? Again, the way Ruth and y'all have structured this process, it's very methodical, and it's very kind of structured. This is not intended to result in revisions to your code or immediately. It's really just to give you some examples, from around Texas and around the country, and to take it slow and to really see what potentially could be appropriate in Sugarland. Y'all have had some, projects that have generated a lot of discussion, it sounds like. So I think that's a really wise approach. This is just going to help you move forward methodically to see if there might be some things you want to consider. Ruth, Cam, have I left anything out? For commissioners, anything else you want to add?
I'm curious, does the possibility exist that, that your recommendation is do nothing? Is it your code can stand, or are we on a track and charged with a redevelopment facet that we need to add, which is fine, and that's what I believe this is.
I think it's premature to say, Commissioner. We really want to go back and study your plan and study the activity centers, the RACs and the NACs, and really compare them to the zoning code and see if that's a good fit, what you have now in the plan development process, and then just give you some flavor of how other communities have dealt with similar issues. I don't have a recommendation right now, and I don't know where we're going to end up. I never like to go into a project with recommendations before we actually do the work.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think, as Matt mentioned, this process was really set up this way very intentionally because we didn't want to go into this with a preconceived notion of where we're going to come out. We, as staff, have some ideas of I think what we'd like to see improved, or some ways we might be able to simplify the process from our perspective. But also recognizing that there are a lot of needs, that need to be met with different parties, the Planning and Zoning Commission, developers, the City Council, and so what we really want to do is see what other communities do and how are they best achieving those goals as well, because there are a lot of other communities that have done this and maybe in different ways than we currently do. So we're really excited to kind of get to that next step and hear from the other communities and start kind of formulating a recommendation.
And if just real quickly, y'all's comments are really helpful tonight to help guide our interviews now, because somebody made the comment early on about community buy-in, and that was one of the successful key elements of a successful redevelopment project. And that's an excellent point, and that's really something that I think Gabby and I can now drill in on in our interviews with those case study communities to talk specifically about that issue. So we really appreciate y'all's feedback.
And if I may, just one closing statement for me at least. The concept of redevelopment is new to us, frankly. I mean, we have been a new city that's been growing. And so I think this is an educational process for staff as well, in terms of what and how do we help redevelopment, be achievable. And so I echo everything that everybody's been saying about, we don't have any preconceived notions about this. We are learning as well. So together.
So this is going to go to City Council, obviously, correct? I mean, we're not making the decisions on P&Z, because things would have to be changed in the process via City Council approval. Is that correct, Ruth, or whoever wants to answer that? Yes. And so when the results come in, we'll be granted a courtesy of what the results of the process are. Then all of that rolls up into our comments on it and your comments, and that rolls up to the City Council, right? Okay.
Right. We'll be taking a recommendation forward, and I think we definitely will be looking for your input as well. As part of that. When we get to the end, but certainly we'd be coming to the commission first and then going to City Council ultimately.
Will it be a two-step process? Do we get to see a draft and then comment and see a final? This is where I'm going. I mean, that was half a joke, but I'm sorry?
Oh, it was good. I appreciated that one.
Matt, do you want to feel that?
I know we had structured the where we'll have an initial draft. I just cannot recall if it was a draft that the P&Z would see, and then at what point it would be revised. I think it was more of an internal staff draft review that then would get presented to the commission.
Okay.
And then we'll take what we hear from you and carry that forward to the City Council.
Yeah, okay. If I may, let me make a suggestion in that regard too, for facilitating that process. Like tonight, I mean, look, I think we've got a very capable commission here, and we've got a lot of commissioners with a lot of different experience in different areas. And I think the discussion, hopefully you all felt like the discussion was robust. It probably would have been greatly improved by giving us the questions in advance, because what you got in response was just, you got all the materials, we got the land use plan, and everyone brings their history with it. And then you get into the meeting and you see it for the first time, and you're just developing stuff off the cuff. So we can do that and give pretty valuable feedback. But I think the best feedback would be giving this group a little bit of time to study, whatever it is that you want us to comment on and provide additional feedback on. And to the extent that you're in a position, to share any of that earlier and not make it more of an extemporaneous exercise, I think that would be helpful.
And I apologize, Chairman. I thought that there were some questions provided ahead of time. I apologize if that did not happen. But we did provide, Gabby and Matt put together a little survey and just a Survey Monkey. And so what we'll do is send that to you guys. And if there is anything that you think of that, comes after the conversation this evening, please feel free to include that in the survey, take a few minutes and go in there and put any comments that you might have that you forgot to bring up tonight, or again, that came up maybe as a result of someone else's comments. But we can certainly make sure that you have additional information ahead of time.
And to be clear, I remember the Survey Monkey. I mean, I remember getting that. I mean, I'm Candidly, I will tell you, I didn't necessarily connect that to this exercise, but I mean, in fairness, I did receive that and answer the questions, and I'm sure other folks did as well.
Yeah, we appreciate your point about just, making the meetings as efficient as they can, Commissioner, and getting you questions in advance. It was intended to be the same as the survey questions. We modified them a little bit, but this was the same general approach.
That's fair.
Yeah, and some of the questions also were out in an email last week. So there were a couple of questions to kind of get your mind going and kind of generating some ideas. But we can definitely send something more prominent next time as well.
In that same vein, will we be meeting with them again before this final product comes before us? In a workshop like this, or is this going to be the only workshop? What's the thinking at this point in time?
This is the only one set up right now in the current scope.
Okay.
But I would point out that, any potential implementation that may follow would definitely involve much additional input from stakeholders, and including this body. So even after the recommendation, any draft of anything that gets worked up would be input, get sufficient input through that process.
I'm sorry. Anything that comes up after this meeting, we just route it through Lisa? Would that be wise? If I think of something, send it through Lisa?
Please do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anytime we get more into a drafting situation, we definitely, there's a robust series of meetings and discussions usually to go through those drafts. Again, this was intended as a preliminary first step, just to give you all some more information about the way other communities have started to look at these issues.
Great. All right, anything else on the workshop?
Just that I appreciate everybody's work, and I hope I didn't come off as too whiny.
No, and I want to echo that. Thank you to everyone that participated. So Ruth, thank you for the presentation. Cam, thank you for participating as well. Matt and Gabby, it was good to meet you. I'm sure this group looks forward to working with you. And let's see, Lauren, thank you for your comments. I don't want to leave, that's part of the downside of thanking people is, you're going to leave someone out. And if I did, that's not intentional, but I thought it was a good discussion. And thank you very well as well to the commissioners as well. Let's move on to item 6A, reports. We had a February City Council meeting and 2 March meetings. Who had the February 23rd meeting?
I did. It was a really short meeting. There was a
Congratulations.
There was a short consent agenda, and really there was only 2 items of major interest. One was a professional services contract with HAF on some drainage improvements that are long overdue at Avalon, and in Avalon at Commonwealth and Elkins Boulevard there. And then I guess the implementation or the ordinance about emergency powers extending those, I think that spawned from the storm. But those are only 2 items on the February agenda.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And did the same person, who had March 2nd?
I did. Okay. March 2nd, we had, that involved us as we approved the Quick Quack was approved on March 2nd. So they're coming, guys. We got another car wash coming to Sugarland, so we're excited about that. In other business, there was in districts 2 and 3, those council people are running unopposed, so there will be no elections in those districts. And then a couple of cool things, and I actually sat all the way through them. They had the annual report outs for the fire and the police department, and it was actually pretty neat to sit through. I've never listened to that before, but really awesome to find out we live in the 4th safest city in the state of Texas. So kudos to the city once again on being an awesome place to live. And on the March 16th meeting, Women's Month recognition, recognized a lot of ladies that were at council and people on staff. They talked about the trash issue and the leftover storm green issue that they were addressing, and driving around the city the last couple of days, it looks like that's being addressed. Involving us, 24-hour fitness was approved. So council approved the rezoning of 24-hour fitness. And that was about it.
Fantastic. Thanks for the reporting. Yeah, I've always thought that the police and fire that was an interesting one, especially if they get into any of the cool technology.
They absolutely did. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always been pretty cool. Well, thank you, commissioners, for those reports. Item 6B, city staff report. Doug, is that you?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Just a preview, your next meeting will be April 13th on Tuesday, and we will be bringing you a not controversial, but fairly large permanent zoning for the new territory community annexed back at the end of 2017, and we've done the commercial and Great Woods commercial as well. We're now doing the final R1 zoning, as well as a few spots of patio home zoning. And so that was a fairly large notification. We'll be bringing that to you for your review and recommendation at your next meeting. And that's all we have tonight.
Hey, Doug, quick question. Is that going to involve like exhibits? I won't say plats because it's too big, but I mean, you're going to have a map, a full-size map to kind of.
We will definitely have some materials for you there that'll help. It's basically the entire, anything residential that's not commercial.
Okay.
All the single-family areas. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Anything else for the good of the group or the city? All right, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right, I've got a motion to adjourn from Commissioner Canine, a second from Commissioner Watley. Thank you very much for your service. It was good to see you all. Have a great evening. We are adjourned.
Good night, everybody. Bye.
What are you doing now?